The autumn sun cast long shadows over the dusty streets of Monticello, Wyoming Territory, 1876, as Daisy Anderson clutched her shawl around her trembling shoulders, her brother's cruel words still ringing in her ears. "Sold you fair and square for this," Elijah had sneered, holding up a bottle of whiskey while pushing her toward the saloon owner with calloused hands that had once offered protection, but now delivered only betrayal. Daisy's life in the West had been harsh since their parents died 3 years ago, leaving her at the mercy of a brother who'd gradually surrendered himself to drink and gambling. At 20 years old, she'd done everything to keep their small homestead running, while Elijah squandered what little money they earned. She never imagined he'd sink so low as to trade her away like cattle. "She ain't worth more than this bottle," Elijah declared to the gathering crowd of leering men inside Monticello's notorious Golden Spur Saloon. "Stubborn as a mule and twice as ornery." Daisy fought back tears, her honey-brown hair falling across her face as she tried to hide her shame. The saloon owner, Vernon Pike, examined her like she was livestock, circling with an appraising eye that made her skin crawl. "I reckon she'd bring in customers," Pike mused, reaching out to lift her chin. "Pretty enough, once we clean her up." "Take your hands off the lady." The deep voice cut through the din of the saloon like a knife. The crowd parted as a tall man stepped forward, his presence commanding immediate attention. Owen Irwin stood just over 6 feet tall, his broad shoulders filling out a worn leather vest over a simple white shirt. His face, partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, bore the weathered look of a man who lived under the open sky. "This ain't your business, Irwin," Pike growled, though his hand dropped away from Daisy's face. "The girl's been sold fair and square." "Selling people ain't legal in any territory I know of," Owen replied calmly, though his blue eyes held a dangerous glint. "How much?" Elijah stepped forward eagerly. "More than a bottle of whiskey, that's for sure." Owen's gaze never left Daisy's face as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. With deliberate movements, he emptied its contents onto the nearest table. Gold coins spilled across the wood, gleaming in the lamplight. 20 double eagles," he said. "That's $400. More than enough to buy your freedom and then some." A hushed murmur rippled through the crowd. $400 was a small fortune in the territory, enough to buy a decent parcel of land or a fine string of horses. Pike reached for the gold, but Owen's hand clamped around his wrist. "The lady decides where she goes." Daisy stared at the stranger, this Owen Irwin who'd appeared like an avenging angel. Why would a man pay such a sum for a woman he didn't know? The question must have shown on her face. "No strings attached, miss," he said quietly. "You take the gold and go wherever you please, or I can offer you safe passage to the next town. Your choice entirely." Elijah's face darkened with greed. "She's my sister. That gold's mine by rights." "You forfeited any rights when you tried to sell her," Owen replied, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of steel that made Elijah take a step back. "Miss Anderson makes her own decisions now." Daisy looked at the gold, then at her brother's flushed, angry face, and finally at the quiet strength in Owen Irwin's eyes. In that moment, she made her choice. "I'll go with you, Mr. Irwin," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. Owen nodded once, then swept the gold back into the pouch, keeping out 5 coins, which he tossed to Pike. "For any trouble," he said. The rest he handed to Daisy. "Your property, Miss Anderson." Pike looked like he might object, but something in Owen's stance made him reconsider. Elijah wasn't so wise. "You can't just take her," he shouted, lunging forward. His movements were clumsy from drink, and Owen sidestepped him easily, catching Elijah's arm and twisting it behind his back in one fluid motion. "Your sister isn't property," Owen said, his voice low but carrying in the suddenly quiet saloon. "And if I ever hear you've tried something like this again, with any woman, I'll find you." He released Elijah, who stumbled and fell to his knees. Owen turned to Daisy and offered his arm. "Shall we, Miss Anderson?" As they stepped out into the fading daylight, Daisy felt the weight of the gold in her hands and the lightness of unexpected freedom in her heart. "Why did you do that?" she asked as they walked toward the livery stable at the end of the street. Owen considered her question for a moment. "My mother was sold by her father to pay gambling debts when she was young. A good man helped her escape. I guess I'm just returning the favor to the world." "But $400. Gold comes and goes," he said simply. "A person's freedom is worth more." At the livery, a magnificent chestnut stallion waited alongside a sturdy paint mare. "The paint is yours if you want her," Owen said. "I bought her this morning, needing a pack horse, but she's got a good temperament for riding." Daisy approached the mare cautiously, letting the horse sniff her hand before stroking its velvet nose. "She's beautiful," she looked back at Owen. "But I can't accept all this. The gold was already too much." "Consider it an investment in your future," he replied, "whatever that might be." As they rode out of Monticello, Daisy felt a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. She was leaving everything she'd known, heading into uncertainty with a man she'd just met. Yet somehow, for the first time in years, she felt safe. They made camp that evening by a small creek where Owen efficiently built a fire and prepared a simple meal of beans, bacon, and coffee. He kept a respectful distance, setting up her bedroll on the opposite side of the fire from his own. "Where are we headed?" Daisy finally asked as they watched the stars emerge above them. "My ranch is about 3 days' ride from here," Owen said, pouring her more coffee. "It's not much, but there's a small cabin where you can stay until you decide what you want to do. The nearest town is Green River, about half a day's ride from there." "You have a ranch?" Daisy asked, surprised. Most cowboys she'd known were drifters, working wherever they could find employment. Owen nodded. 200 acres along the Sweet River, started with 40 acres 4 years ago, worked cattle drives to save enough to expand. It's good land." "And you work it alone?" A shadow passed over his face. "Had a partner once. He died last winter. Pneumonia took him quick." "I'm sorry," Daisy said softly. Owen nodded his acknowledgement. "Been managing alone since then. It's not ideal, but I make do." He studied her across the fire. "What about you? You've got enough gold to start fresh anywhere you want." Daisy looked down at the pouch he'd given her, still unable to believe her sudden change in fortune. "I don't know. I never thought beyond surviving each day with Elijah." She hesitated. "After our parents died, he changed. The drinking got worse. The gambling. I kept hoping he'd find his way back to being the brother I remembered." "Some men don't find their way back," Owen said quietly. They fell silent, listening to the crackling fire and the night sounds around them. Daisy found herself studying Owen when he wasn't looking, the careful way he moved, the strength in his hands, the kindness in his eyes that contradicted the hardness of his jawline. He was handsome, she realized with a small start, in a weathered, understated way. "You should get some sleep," Owen said eventually. "We've got a long ride tomorrow." As Daisy settled into her bedroll, pulling the blanket tight around her shoulders, she wondered at the strange turn her life had taken. Hours ago, she'd been facing a life of degradation and servitude. Now, she lay under the stars with gold in her possession and possibilities before her that she'd never dared to dream about. She looked across the fire at Owen, who sat with his back against a fallen log, hat pulled low over his eyes, but clearly still alert. A man who'd paid in gold to save a stranger, asking nothing in return. For the first time in years, Daisy fell asleep feeling hope. The next day dawned clear and cool, with the promise of warmth as the sun climbed higher. Owen was already up when Daisy awoke, preparing breakfast and tending to the horses. "Good morning," he said, handing her a tin cup of steaming coffee. "Hope you slept well." "Better than I have in a long time," she admitted, accepting the cup gratefully. The coffee was strong and bracing, exactly what she needed. As they ate a breakfast of johnny cakes and jerky, Daisy found herself studying the terrain around them. The Wyoming landscape stretched vast and beautiful in every direction, rolling hills giving way to distant mountains. "Have you always lived in Wyoming Territory?" she asked. Owen shook his head. "Born in Missouri. Came west after the war, was just a boy when it ended, but old enough to see what it did to the land and the people. Wanted something different. He sipped his coffee. What about you? Born in Kentucky, my father got the idea to move west when I was 16. Said there were opportunities for a man willing to work hard. She smiled sadly. He wasn't wrong about the hard work. They packed up camp efficiently and continued their journey, riding side by side when the trail allowed it. Owen proved to be a surprisingly good conversationalist when encouraged, telling her about his years working cattle drives and saving to buy his land. The first winter was the hardest, he admitted. Had nothing but a lean-to shelter and 10 head of cattle, nearly froze to death in a February blizzard. How did you survive? Daisy asked, genuinely interested. Stubbornness mostly, he said with a small smile. And luck. A Shoshone hunting party found me half frozen and brought me to their camp. Stayed with them till the worst of winter passed. Learned a lot about surviving out here. By midday, they stopped near a small stream to rest the horses and eat a cold lunch. Daisy had noticed Owen scanning their back trail periodically throughout the morning. Are you worried someone's following us? She finally asked. Owen's expression remained neutral. Just being cautious. Your brother struck me as the type who might have second thoughts once the whiskey wore off. The thought of Elijah pursuing them sent a chill through Daisy despite the warm sun. He would come for the gold, not for me, she said quietly. Owen nodded. Either way, it's best to be vigilant. He studied her for a moment. You ride well. Not many women I've met sit a horse like you do. Our farm in Kentucky bred horses, she explained. I was riding before I could walk, according to my mother. One of the hardest parts of coming west was selling our mares. Father said we couldn't manage them on the journey. As they continued riding that afternoon, Daisy found herself sharing more about her life before Monticello, her mother's gentle ways, her father's dreams for their future in the West, the close relationship she'd once had with Elijah before grief and alcohol transformed him. Owen listened attentively, occasionally offering a comment or question that showed he was genuinely interested. It had been so long since anyone had actually listened to her that Daisy found the experience both novel and unexpectedly moving. They made camp earlier than the previous day, in a protected hollow with good visibility of the surrounding area. Owen showed her how to set snares, and they were rewarded with 2 rabbits for their dinner. As they sat by the fire that evening, Daisy cleaned her new revolver while Owen roasted the rabbits. He'd presented her with the weapon that morning, a Smith & Wesson Model 3, smaller than his Colt, but still substantial in her hands. Every woman out here should know how to use one, he'd said simply, showing her how to load and clean it. Have you always been so prepared? She asked now, carefully wiping down the cylinder. Owen turned the spit with the rabbits. Out here, preparation is the difference between living and dying. Is that why you had so much gold with you in Monticello? Were you preparing to buy something? A shadow crossed his face. Was heading to Denver to buy breeding stock. Been saving for 2 years to expand the herd. The implication of his words hit her. You spent your breeding stock money on me? He shrugged, not meeting her eyes. There'll be other opportunities. Daisy set the revolver down carefully. I can't let you sacrifice your plans like that. Take the gold back. It's yours, he said firmly. I made my choice. Then let me repay you somehow, she hesitated. I could work at your ranch. I know horses and I learn quickly. I could help until I've worked off the debt. Owen looked at her then, his expression unreadable in the firelight. There's no debt, Miss Anderson. What I did freely. Daisy, she said. Please call me Daisy. And I understand it was freely given, but I want to help, at least until I decide what to do next. He considered her for a long moment, then nodded. All right, Daisy, if that's what you want. But you're free to leave any time. The rabbits were delicious, flavored with wild herbs Owen had gathered. As they ate, Daisy found herself feeling more at ease with this quiet, thoughtful man who seemed so different from other men she'd encountered in the West. Tell me about your ranch, she encouraged. What's it like? His face softened as he described his home, the cabin he'd expanded from 1 room to 3, the barn he'd built with his partner, the small herd of cattle, the garden plot, and the stream that ran year-round along the eastern property line. "Sounds like paradise," Daisy said when he finished. "Far from it," Owen replied with a small smile. "It's rough and unfinished, and there's always more work than hours in the day. But it's mine, and there's a kind of freedom in that I never found working for others." That night, as Daisy lay in her bedroll looking up at the star-filled sky, she thought about freedom and choices. For the first time in years, she had options before her. She could go anywhere, do anything. The gold in her possession represented possibilities she'd never dreamed of. Yet as she drifted toward sleep, it was the image of a small ranch along the sweet river that filled her thoughts, and the man who had built it with his own hands. The third day of their journey brought a change in the weather. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon by mid-morning, and the wind picked up, carrying the smell of impending rain. "We need to make better time," Owen said, studying the sky. "That storm looks like it means business." They pushed the horses harder, stopping only briefly to rest them. By early afternoon, the first fat raindrops began to fall, quickly turning into a steady downpour that soaked through their clothes, despite the oilskin dusters Owen had providentially packed. "There's a line shack about an hour ahead," he shouted over the increasing wind. "Used by cattle outfits during drives. We can shelter there." The rain was coming in almost horizontally by the time they spotted the small, weathered cabin nestled against a rocky outcropping. They dismounted in the relative shelter of a stand of pine trees, and Owen led the horses around to a lean-to at the back of the shack while Daisy hurried inside. The interior was Spartan, but dry, a single room with a small iron stove, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a narrow cot against one wall. Daisy quickly located a lantern and matches on a shelf, and had light flickering in the growing dimness by the time Owen entered, carrying their saddlebags. "Storm's settling in," he said, water streaming from his hat and coat. "Might be here until morning." Together they worked efficiently. Owen got a fire going in the stove, while Daisy found a small store of supplies in a tin-lined chest: coffee, beans, salt pork, and hardtack. There was even a bottle of whiskey, which made Owen raise an eyebrow. "Trail courtesy," he explained. "Leave something if you can. Take only what you need. Replace what you use when possible." He set the whiskey aside and hung their wet coats near the stove to dry. The small cabin warmed quickly, the rhythmic drumming of rain on the roof creating a cozy atmosphere despite the primitive conditions. They sat at the small table eating a hot meal of beans and salt pork, both grateful for the shelter. "We were lucky to reach this place before the worst hit," Daisy said, glancing toward the single window where rain lashed against the glass. Owen nodded. "Should clear by morning. We can make my place by tomorrow evening if the creeks haven't risen too much." A comfortable silence fell between them as they finished their meal. Daisy was acutely aware of their proximity in the small cabin, but Owen maintained the same respectful distance he had throughout their journey. After they had cleaned their dishes, Owen pulled a deck of cards from his saddlebag. "Care for a game? Might help pass the time." They played several hands of poker, using beans as chips, with Daisy surprising Owen by winning more often than not. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked, after she took another pot with a full house. Daisy smiled ruefully. "Watching Elijah lose our money. I paid attention to what worked and what didn't." As the evening progressed, their conversation deepened. Owen spoke of his time during the war, not fighting, as he'd been too young, but living in a border state torn apart by divided loyalties. Daisy shared more about her parents, the dreams they'd had for a new life in the West that had died with them. "Sometimes I wonder what they'd think of what became of us," she said quietly. "Elijah and me, if they'd be disappointed." "They'd be proud of your strength," Owen replied. "Not many would have endured what you have." A particularly strong gust of wind rattled the cabin, making them both look up. "Storm's getting worse," Owen observed, rising to add more wood to the stove. The temperature in the cabin had dropped slightly as night deepened. "What will we do about sleeping arrangements?" Daisy asked, voicing the practical concern that had been on her mind. Owen gestured to the cot. You take that. I'll make do on the floor. That hardly seems fair. We could share? The words slipped out before she could reconsider them, and Daisy felt her cheeks warm. I mean, it's cold and I'll be fine, Owen said gently, clearly understanding her embarrassment. I've slept on worse than a wooden floor. True to his word, he made a pallet near the stove, using his bedroll and saddle for a pillow. Daisy took the cot, wrapping herself in the blankets that smelled of wood smoke and dust. Despite her fatigue, sleep eluded her. She lay listening to the storm and watching Owen's silhouette in the dim light from the banked fire. His steady breathing eventually told her he'd fallen asleep, seemingly untroubled by the hard floor or the howling wind. She thought about how different he was from any man she'd known, honest, considerate, asking nothing in return for his generosity. In 3 days, he'd shown her more kindness than she'd experienced in years. When Daisy finally drifted to sleep, it was with the realization that she was developing feelings for Owen Irwin that went far beyond gratitude. Morning brought clearing skies and a world washed clean by the night storm. They set out early, Owen warning that they might encounter swollen creeks and difficult terrain after such heavy rain. His prediction proved accurate when they reached what should have been a small stream, but was now a fast-moving expanse of water too dangerous to ford directly. We'll need to head upstream, find a narrower crossing, Owen said, studying the rushing water with a frown. It'll add a few hours to our journey. They followed the stream for nearly 2 miles before finding a suitable spot where the water funneled between 2 large boulders, creating a narrower but more turbulent crossing. I'll go first, Owen said. Watch how I pick my way across. If anything happens to me, ride hard for Green River. It's northeast of here. Daisy's heart pounded as she watched him urge his stallion into the rushing water. The big horse fought against the current, carefully placing each hoof on the rocky stream bed. At the deepest point, the water rose to the horse's chest, but Owen kept him moving steadily forward until they reached the opposite bank. Take it slow and follow my path, Owen called across the water. Daisy patted the paint mare's neck reassuringly before guiding her toward the stream. The mare was nervous but responsive, stepping carefully into the cold water. Halfway across, the current seemed to strengthen, pushing against them with increasing force. Keep coming, Owen encouraged from the bank, where he stood ready with a rope if needed. For a terrifying moment, the mare lost her footing on the slippery rocks, stumbling sideways in the current. Daisy fought to stay mounted as cold water soaked through her boots and pants. She heard Owen shout something, but couldn't make out the words over the rush of water. The mare regained her balance and lunged forward powerfully, climbing up the opposite bank where Owen immediately grabbed her bridle, steadying them both. You all right? He asked, his face tight with concern as he helped Daisy dismount. She nodded, though her hands were shaking. Just wet and cold. Owen immediately began unpacking dry clothes for her. Get changed behind those rocks. We need to keep moving to warm up. They rode hard for the next few hours, the exercise helping to drive out the chill from their unexpected dunking. By late afternoon, Owen pointed to a distant smudge of green in the otherwise brown and gold landscape. There it is, he said. Sweet River Ranch. As they drew closer, Daisy could make out a small but solid cabin nestled against a backdrop of cottonwood trees, with a sturdy barn and corral nearby. A stream, presumably the Sweet River, wound through the property, bordered by lush grass that explained the name. It's beautiful, she said sincerely. Owen looked at his home with obvious pride. It's not much compared to some spreads, but every board and post is mine. They rode into the yard as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the buildings. Owen helped Daisy dismount before tending to the horses, refusing her offers of assistance. Go on inside and warm up, he said, handing her a key. I'll take care of the animals. The cabin was simple but well crafted, with a main room containing a cook stove, table, chairs, and a small sofa covered in a colorful Navajo blanket. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. 2 doors led off the main room, one to what appeared to be Owen's bedroom, and another to a smaller room that contained a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a small table. "This was James's room, my partner," Owen explained when he came in, finding her standing in the doorway of the second bedroom. "It's yours for as long as you want to stay." "Thank you," Daisy said, turning to face him. Standing in his home, seeing the life he'd built with his own hands, she felt a new appreciation for the man who'd rescued her from such a different fate. Owen busied himself lighting lamps and stoking a fire in the stove. "It's not much, but it's warm and dry." "It's perfect," she replied honestly. That night, after a simple but satisfying meal, they sat before the fireplace drinking coffee. The domesticity of the scene struck Daisy how natural it felt to be here with him, how comfortable his presence had become in just a few days. "What happens now?" she asked eventually. Owen set his cup down carefully. "That depends on you. You're free to go whenever you wish. Green River's half a day's ride. There's a stagecoach that could take you to Denver or even back east if that's what you want. And if I want to stay? To work here as we discussed?" He looked at her then, his expression guarded. "The offer stands. There's plenty of work and I could use the help." He hesitated. "But I want you to be sure. This isn't an easy life." "I've never been afraid of hard work," Daisy said, "and I've nowhere else I particularly want to go." Owen nodded slowly. "Then stay, at least for now. We can see how it suits you." Later, as Daisy settled into the narrow bed in what had been James's room, she listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch at night, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods, the occasional creak of the cabin settling. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of belonging, of possibility. She had no illusions about the challenges ahead. Ranch life was demanding, and her arrangement with Owen was undefined beyond her desire to repay him. But as she drifted toward sleep, Daisy realized that for the first time since her parents died, she was looking forward to tomorrow. Life at Sweet River Ranch quickly fell into a rhythm that suited Daisy perfectly. She rose early each morning to help with chores, learning the routine of the cattle operation and proving herself capable and hard-working. Owen was a patient teacher, showing her the tasks needed to keep the small ranch running, how to mend fences, check cattle for illness, repair tack, and a dozen other skills she'd never had occasion to learn before. Within 2 weeks, she had taken over the care of the vegetable garden, which had been neglected since James's death. She coaxed new life from the soil, planting seeds Owen had bought but never found time to sow. "You've got a way with growing things," he observed one evening as they sat on the porch after supper, looking at the neat rows Daisy had cultivated. "That garden hasn't looked so good since my first year here." "I always loved growing things," she admitted. "Had a small herb garden back home before—" She didn't need to finish the thought. Before everything changed, before Elijah's drinking, before she was nearly sold for a bottle of whiskey. Owen nodded his understanding. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the distant hills. These quiet evenings had become Daisy's favorite part of each day, the work done, a good meal shared, and this peaceful time when they would talk or simply enjoy each other's company. She stole a glance at Owen's profile, admiring the strong line of his jaw, now clean-shaven after she'd convinced him to let her trim his beard. He looked younger without it, though the weathered lines around his eyes still spoke of a man who spent his days under the open sky. Her feelings for him had grown stronger with each passing day, but she kept them carefully guarded. Owen had never indicated he saw her as anything more than someone he'd helped who was now helping him in return. His manner remained unfailingly respectful, even as they worked closely together day after day. "We should ride into Green River tomorrow," Owen said, breaking the silence. "Need supplies, and there are some letters I should check for." Daisy nodded, feeling a flutter of excitement at the prospect. She hadn't left the ranch since their arrival nearly a month ago. "I'd like that." The next morning, they set out early for the ride to Green River. The June day was perfect, warm but not hot, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of sage and wildflowers. Daisy wore her best dress, one of two she owned, having left everything behind in Monticello. Green River proved to be larger than she expected, a proper town with a main street boasting several stores, a hotel, a bank, and 2 saloons. The railroad had reached it the previous year, bringing growth and prosperity that showed in the newly painted buildings and busy streets. Their first stop was the general store, where Owen introduced Daisy to the proprietor, Samuel Whitman, and his wife, Martha. The older couple welcomed her warmly, especially Martha, who seemed delighted to have another woman to talk to. "We don't see many new faces, especially not young ladies," Martha said as she helped Daisy select fabric for new clothes. "How are you finding life at Sweet River?" "I like it very much," Daisy replied honestly. "It's peaceful, and the work suits me." Martha's eyes twinkled. "And how do you find Mr. Irwin as an employer? He's been alone out there too long, if you ask me, ever since poor James passed." Daisy felt her cheeks warm. "He's been nothing but kind and respectful." I'm sure he has," Martha said with a knowing smile. "Owen Irwin is one of the good ones, not like some men around these parts." As they continued shopping, Daisy became aware of the curious glances directed their way. A young, unmarried woman accompanying a bachelor rancher was clearly a subject of interest in the small community. "Don't mind them," Owen said quietly as they loaded their purchases into the wagon he'd borrowed from a neighbor for the trip. "Small towns run on gossip." "What are they saying?" Daisy asked, curious despite herself. Owen's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Mostly wondering if you're my mail-order bride or hired help, some betting on which." "Oh," Daisy felt her face flush again. "And what did you tell them?" "That it's no one's business but ours," he replied simply. Their final stop was the post office, where Owen collected several letters that had been holding for him. As he was reading through them, the door opened and a well-dressed man entered, stopping short when he saw Owen. "Irwin," the man said, his tone cool. "Heard you were in town." Owen's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Prescott. Didn't expect to see you here." Theodore Prescott was tall and imposing, with the soft hands and fine clothes of a man who made his money through others' labor. He glanced at Daisy with undisguised interest. "Aren't you going to introduce me to your lovely companion?" he asked, removing his hat with an exaggerated flourish. Owen's jaw tightened. "Miss Daisy Anderson, Mr. Theodore Prescott. He owns the Golden Star Ranch northeast of here." "Enchanted, Miss Anderson," Prescott said, taking Daisy's hand before she could refuse and pressing his lips to it. "A rare pleasure to meet a beautiful woman in this wilderness." Daisy withdrew her hand as quickly as politeness allowed, disliking both his forwardness and the predatory gleam in his eyes. "Mr. Prescott." "Miss Anderson is helping me at Sweet River," Owen said, his tone making it clear the conversation was over. "Is she now?" Prescott's eyebrows rose. "How fortunate for you." The implication in his tone made Daisy's spine stiffen. Before she could respond, Owen stepped slightly in front of her. "We should be going. It's a long ride back." As they left the post office, Daisy could feel Prescott's gaze following them down the street. "I don't think I care for Mr. Prescott," she said when they were out of earshot. Owen's expression was grim as he helped her into the wagon. "You've got good instincts. Prescott's been trying to buy out every small ranch in the valley. Those who won't sell have had mysterious problems. Cattle disappearing, wells fouled, fences cut." "He's done this to you?" Owen nodded as he climbed up beside her. "3 times now. Lost 8 head last fall that I'm certain he took. Can't prove it, though." "Why does he want the land so badly?" "Railroad's planning a spur line through the valley. Land values will triple once it's built." Owen clicked to the horses, setting them in motion. "Prescott aims to control as much of it as he can before word gets out." As they rode home, Daisy thought about the encounter, understanding better now why Owen was so protective of his land. Sweet River wasn't just a ranch, it was his future, his dream of independence made real. And, she realized with sudden clarity, it was becoming her dream too. The following weeks brought increasing heat as July settled over the valley. The garden flourished under Daisy's care, providing fresh vegetables that supplemented their meals of beef and the occasional game Owen hunted. One particularly hot afternoon, Owen returned from checking fence lines to find Daisy standing in the shallow part of the Sweet River, her skirts hitched up to her knees as she cooled her feet in the flowing water. "Hope you don't mind," she called when she spotted him. The heat was getting unbearable. Owen dismounted, leading his horse to drink upstream from her. "The river belongs to everyone," he said with a smile, or no one, depending how you look at it. He removed his hat and splashed water on his face and neck, washing away the dust of the day. Daisy watched him surreptitiously, admiring the way the water darkened his hair and ran in rivulets down his tanned forearms. "We could eat out here tonight," she suggested impulsively. "It's too hot to be inside." Owen looked up, considering the idea. "Been a while since I had a picnic supper." That evening, they spread a blanket beneath the cottonwoods by the river and enjoyed a simple meal of cold chicken, biscuits, and fresh vegetables from the garden. The setting sun painted the landscape in gold and amber, while a gentle breeze cooled the air. "This was a fine idea," Owen said, leaning back against a tree trunk. "Best meal I've had in a long time." Daisy smiled, pleased by his approval. "My mother used to say food tastes better outdoors." "Wise woman," he commented. After a pause, he asked, "Do you miss your family? Your life before?" Daisy considered the question. "I miss my parents every day, and I miss the brother Elijah used to be before." She trailed off, then continued more firmly. "But I don't miss the life I had in Monticello. There was no future there for me, only survival." "And here?" Owen's voice was careful, neutral. Daisy met his eyes. "Here I feel like I'm living, not just surviving. I'm building something, contributing. It matters what I do each day." Owen nodded slowly. "That's how I've always felt about this place, that what I do matters, even if it's just to me." "It matters to me too," she said softly. Something shifted in Owen's expression, a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. For a moment she thought he might say something important, something that would change everything between them. Instead, he stood and offered his hand to help her up. "It's getting dark. We should head back." Daisy took his hand, feeling the strength in his calloused fingers, and allowed him to pull her to her feet. They stood close together in the gathering twilight, her hand still in his, neither moving away. "Daisy," he began, his voice lower than usual. "Yes?" Her heart quickened at his tone. Before he could continue, the distant sound of a gunshot broke the stillness. Owen's head snapped up, his body instantly alert. "That came from near the north pasture," he said, all trace of softness gone from his voice. They hurried back to the cabin, where Owen grabbed his rifle and ammunition. "Stay here," he instructed. "Lock the door. If I'm not back in 2 hours, take my horse and ride for Green River." "I'm coming with you," Daisy said firmly, already retrieving the revolver he'd given her. Owen looked like he wanted to argue, but instead nodded tersely. "Stay behind me and do exactly as I say." They rode toward the north pasture, where the best grazing land stretched along the river. The moon was rising, providing just enough light to make out shapes in the darkness. Owen led them cautiously, stopping often to listen. They had just reached the edge of the pasture when they heard voices and saw the flicker of lantern light near the fence line. "Get down," Owen whispered, dismounting and motioning for Daisy to do the same. They secured the horses to a tree and crept forward on foot. From their position behind a large boulder, they could see 3 men working by lantern light to herd several head of cattle through a section of cut fence. The cattle wore Owen's brand, a stylized SI for Sweet Irwin, as he'd once explained to Daisy. "Prescott's men," Owen murmured, his voice tight with anger. "Caught them red-handed this time." He raised his rifle, aiming not at the men but into the air, and fired a single shot. The rustlers startled, dropping the lantern, which fortunately went out rather than setting the dry grass ablaze. "That's Sweet River cattle you're stealing," Owen called out, his voice carrying in the still night air. "Leave them and ride out, or the next shot won't be a warning." For a tense moment, Daisy thought the men might fight. She gripped her revolver tightly, praying she wouldn't have to use it. Then, one of the rustlers shouted something to the others, and they scrambled for their horses. "This ain't over, Irwin," one called as they galloped away. Owen kept his rifle trained on them until they disappeared into the darkness. Only then did he lower it, releasing a long breath. "Are you all right?" he asked, turning to Daisy. She nodded, though her hands were shaking slightly as she holstered her revolver. "Yes? Are they gone for good?" "For tonight at least." Owen moved to inspect the cattle, counting them quickly. "Looks like all 6 are still here. We need to fix this fence before they wander off, then get them back with the main herd." They worked together by moonlight, Owen mending the fence while Daisy kept the cattle from straying further. It was well past midnight when they finally returned to the cabin, both exhausted but relieved that the rustlers had been thwarted. "You should have stayed behind," Owen said as they unsaddled the horses in the barn. "Could have been dangerous." "You might have needed help," Daisy replied simply. Owen paused, studying her face in the lantern light. "You weren't afraid?" "Of course I was afraid," she admitted, "but that doesn't mean I shouldn't have come." A slow smile spread across his face, one of the rare, full smiles that transformed his serious features. "You're something else, Daisy Anderson." The moment from earlier by the river seemed to hover between them again, fragile and full of possibility. This time, it was Daisy who broke it, suddenly uncertain of herself. "We should get some sleep," she said, turning toward the cabin. "Tomorrow will come early." Owen nodded, the smile fading. "Yes, it always does." August brought news that changed everything. A letter arrived from the railroad company, confirming what Owen had suspected. They were indeed planning a spur line through the valley, and Sweet River Ranch sat directly in the proposed path. "They're offering to buy a right-of-way through the property," Owen explained as they sat at the kitchen table, the letter spread between them. "The offer's fair, maybe even generous." "That's good, isn't it?" Daisy asked, studying his troubled expression. Owen ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of his inner conflict. "It would mean cash in hand, enough to expand the herd significantly." He sighed. "But it also means a railroad cutting through the heart of the ranch, with all the noise and disruption that brings. What will you do?" "I have a month to decide." He looked out the window toward the rolling hills that had been his home for 4 years. "The smart move is to take the money, use it to build the ranch into something larger." Daisy nodded thoughtfully. "But you're worried about losing the peace you came here for." Owen looked back at her, a flash of surprise in his eyes. "Yes, exactly. Not many would understand that." "I understand," she said simply. Their eyes held for a long moment before Owen stood abruptly. "I need to ride the north boundary today. Would you like to come along? Might be our last chance to see it as it is now." They spent the day riding the perimeter of the ranch, Owen pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of how each section of the property had been acquired and improved. Daisy listened attentively, asking questions and offering observations that showed how deeply she'd come to care for Sweet River in the months she'd been there. As the afternoon waned, they stopped atop a hill that offered a panoramic view of the valley. Below them stretched the patchwork of grazing land, the ribbon of the Sweet River, and in the distance, the cabin and barn that had become home. "It's beautiful," Daisy said, drinking in the vista. "I can see why you fought so hard for it." Owen dismounted and helped her down from her horse. They stood side by side, looking out over his kingdom, small by some standards, but rich in what mattered. "When I first saw this valley," he said quietly, "I knew this was where I wanted to build my life. Everything I've done since has been toward making that dream real." "You've succeeded," Daisy replied. "Sweet River is everything a home should be." Owen turned to look at her, something unreadable in his expression. "Daisy, there's something I need to ask you." Her heart quickened at his tone. "Yes? You've been at Sweet River for 3 months now. You've more than repaid any perceived debt. The gold I gave you is still yours. You could go anywhere, start any life you choose." "Are you asking me to leave?" The question came out more vulnerable than she'd intended. "No," he said quickly. "God, no. I'm asking why you stay." The directness of the question caught her off guard. Daisy looked away, gathering her courage before meeting his gaze again. "I stay because I want to be here," she said finally. because for the first time in years, I feel like I belong somewhere, with someone. Owen took a step closer. Is that the only reason? Daisy's breath caught in her throat. This was the moment when everything would change between them for better or worse. She chose honesty. I stay because I've grown to care for you, Owen. More than I should, perhaps, given our arrangement. Something like relief washed over his features. There is no arrangement anymore, Daisy. Hasn't been for a long time. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and took her hand in his. I care for you too, more than I've cared for anyone in a very long time. Then why have you kept your distance? She asked softly. Why have you been so careful never to touch me, never to let me see what you're feeling? Because you came to me for protection, he replied, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. I gave my word that you were free, that there were no strings attached to my help. I couldn't risk you feeling obligated or pressured. Daisy stepped closer, her free hand rising to touch his face. I've never felt obligated, Owen. Everything I've done has been my choice, including this. She rose on tiptoes and pressed her lips to his, a gentle, questioning kiss. For a heartbeat, Owen remained still, then his arms came around her, drawing her closer as he responded with a passion that took her breath away. When they finally parted, both breathless, Owen rested his forehead against hers. I've wanted to do that for months, he admitted. What took you so long? She teased, her hands resting on his chest where she could feel his heart racing. I was afraid, he said simply. Afraid you'd leave once you realized you had choices. Afraid you saw me only as the man who helped you, not as someone you could love. Owen Irwin, Daisy said, framing his face with her hands. You're the man who saw my value when my own brother thought I was worth only a bottle of whiskey. You're the man who paid in gold but treated me like a queen. How could I not come to love you? The word hung between them, momentous and true. Love, Owen repeated softly, wonder in his voice. Is that what this is? Yes, Daisy answered without hesitation. I love you, Owen. I think I've been falling in love with you since that first night by the campfire when you told me about your mother. Owen's smile was like sunrise breaking across his face. I love you too, Daisy Anderson. I think I knew it the moment you insisted on coming with me to face those rustlers, fear in your eyes, but determination in every line of your body. He kissed her again, deeper this time. A kiss that spoke of longing, finally fulfilled, and promises for the future. When they separated, the sun was setting behind the distant mountains, painting the valley in shades of gold and purple. We should head back, Owen said reluctantly. It'll be dark soon. As they rode home in the gathering twilight, Daisy felt as though her heart might burst with happiness. The future stretched before them, full of possibilities she had never dared to dream of just a few months ago. Later that evening, as they sat before the fireplace, Owen took her hands in his. Daisy, I need to ask you something important. Yes? She prompted when he hesitated. I'm going to accept the railroad's offer, he said. With that money we can expand the ranch, build a proper house, maybe even buy the Johnson property to the south that's been sitting empty. Daisy nodded, understanding his decision. It's the right choice for the future of Sweet River. Our future, Owen corrected gently. If you'll have me, that is. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object that caught the firelight, a ring with a modest diamond set in gold. This was my mother's. I've kept it all these years, waiting for the right person to give it to. Daisy's breath caught as Owen slid from his chair to one knee before her. Daisy Anderson, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Of building a life with me here at Sweet River, of facing whatever comes our way together? Tears of joy filled her eyes as she nodded. Yes, Owen. Yes, I will marry you. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to gather her into his arms, sealing their promise with a kiss that held all the love and hope they felt for their future together. The autumn day dawned clear and crisp, perfect weather for a wedding. Inside the cabin that had become her home, Daisy stood in the bedroom that was now hers and Owen's, putting the finishing touches on her appearance. The dress she wore was new, made from fine cream-colored fabric they'd purchased in Denver on a trip to file the railroad contract. Martha Whitman had helped her sew it, incorporating lace from Daisy's mother's wedding dress, the one possession she'd managed to bring with her from Monticello. A soft knock at the door announced Martha's arrival. "Oh, my dear, you look absolutely beautiful," the older woman exclaimed, her eyes misting with happy tears. "Owen won't know what hit him." "Thank you for everything," Daisy said, embracing her friend. In the months since their first meeting at the general store, Martha had become like a mother to Daisy, offering advice, companionship, and genuine affection. "It's nearly time," Martha said, adjusting a loose strand of Daisy's hair. The ministers arrived, and Samuel's keeping Owen from pacing a hole in the porch floor. Daisy laughed, picturing her normally calm fiancé in such a state. "I'm ready." They had decided on a simple ceremony at Sweet River, with only a handful of guests, the Whitmans, the neighboring ranchers who had become friends, and a few townspeople from Green River who had welcomed Daisy into their community. As she stepped out onto the porch, Daisy saw Owen waiting for her beneath an arch of autumn flowers and branches that they had constructed the previous day. He wore a new black suit with a crisp white shirt, his hair neatly trimmed and his face clean-shaven. But it was his expression that caught her heart, the look of absolute wonder and love as he watched her approach. Samuel Whitman offered his arm to escort her, a role he had readily agreed to take in the absence of Daisy's father. "He's a fortunate man," Samuel said quietly as they began the walk toward the assembled guests and the waiting groom. "I'm the fortunate one," Daisy replied, her eyes never leaving Owen's face. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, the minister's words carrying across the clear autumn air as Owen and Daisy exchanged vows they had written themselves. When Owen slipped the gold band onto her finger to join her engagement ring, his hands were steady, his voice clear and certain as he promised to love, honor, and cherish her for all his days. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared, beaming at the couple. "Mr. Irwin, you may kiss your bride." Owen drew Daisy into his arms with a tenderness that belied the strength she knew he possessed. His kiss was gentle but full of promise, sealing their union before God and their friends. The celebration that followed was joyful, with music from a fiddle player from town and a feast prepared by the women of Green River who had taken Daisy under their collective wing. As the sun began to set, casting its golden light across the valley, Owen led Daisy away from the festivities to a quiet spot by the river. "Happy, Mrs. Irwin?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist as they looked out over the water. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied, leaning back against his chest. "Are you?" "I have everything I ever wanted," Owen said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "A home, land of my own, and now a wife I love more than life itself." Daisy turned in his arms to face him. "Do you ever think about that day in Monticello? How differently things might have turned out if you hadn't been there?" Owen's expression grew serious. "I think about it often. How close I came to not stopping in that town at all. How many small decisions led us both to that moment." "My brother sold me for a bottle of whiskey," Daisy said, the memory no longer carrying the sting it once had. "And you paid in gold and treated me like a queen." "It's like something from a storybook." "Not a storybook," Owen corrected gently. "Our story. And it's only just beginning." As they returned to their guests, Daisy caught sight of the railroad survey stakes marking the future right-of-way through the eastern part of their property. What had once seemed like an intrusion now represented opportunity. The funds from the agreement had already allowed them to begin construction on a larger house that would stand on this very spot next year, with room for the family they hoped to have. The celebration continued into the evening, with lanterns hung from the trees, creating a magical atmosphere. As they danced beneath the stars to the fiddle's sweet melody, Daisy thought about the journey that had brought her here, the pain and loss, the unexpected rescue, and the slow, beautiful awakening of love between her and Owen. "What are you thinking about?" Owen asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Daisy smiled up at him. "About how sometimes the worst day of your life can lead to the best." He nodded, understanding immediately. "From that bottle of whiskey to this moment." "Exactly," she said. "I wouldn't change a single step of the path that led me to you." As the last guests departed with good wishes and knowing smiles, Owen swept Daisy into his arms and carried her across the threshold of their cabin, soon to be replaced but forever special as the place where their life together had truly begun. "Welcome home, Mrs. Irwin," he said softly, setting her gently on her feet. "I've been home since the moment you found me," Daisy replied, reaching up to touch his beloved face. "I just didn't know it yet." 5 years later, the sound of children's laughter filled the yard of the Sweet River Ranch as Daisy watched from the wide porch of the house she and Owen had built in their second year of marriage. Their 3-year-old son, James, named for Owen's former partner, was attempting to rope a fence post under the patient guidance of his father. Nearby, their infant daughter, Elizabeth, lay in a basket, cooing at the clouds drifting overhead. The ranch had prospered beyond their early dreams. The railroad payment had allowed them to expand their cattle operations significantly, and Owen's wise management had turned Sweet River into one of the most successful small ranches in the region. The railroad itself had brought growth to Green River and increased access to markets for their beef. Daisy's garden had expanded into a small orchard, and she'd become known throughout the area for her preserves and baked goods, which Martha Whitman now sold in the general store. The garden was not merely productive, but beautiful, a riot of flowers surrounding the vegetable plots and fruit trees, making Sweet River an oasis of color in the sometimes harsh landscape. "Mama, look!" James called excitedly as his small loop actually settled around the post. "I did it!" "Well done, darling," Daisy called back, smiling at Owen's look of exaggerated pride. Their son had his father's serious blue eyes, but Daisy's smile and infectious enthusiasm for life. As she watched her family, Daisy felt the familiar wave of gratitude that often overwhelmed her. From the desperate young woman sold by her own brother to this a beloved wife, a mother, a respected member of the community. The journey had been unexpected in every way. They had heard of Elijah only once in the years since Monticello. A drifter passing through Green River had mentioned meeting a broken-down drunk in Denver who claimed to have once sold his sister for whiskey. The man had apparently been in dire straits, working menial jobs to support his drinking habit. Daisy had felt a moment of sadness for the brother she had once loved, but the wound had long since healed, leaving only a faint scar on her heart. Owen came up the steps, James riding on his shoulders and crowing with delight. "This young cowboy needs some refreshment," he announced, swinging their son down to stand on the porch. "And his pa could use some of that lemonade I saw you making earlier." Daisy smiled, rising to kiss them both. "Coming right up." As she moved into the cool interior of the house, she heard Owen settle into one of the porch chairs, beginning one of the stories James loved, tales of the early days of Sweet River, carefully edited to exclude the more dangerous elements. The kitchen was her domain, spacious and well-equipped, with windows that looked out over her garden. Daisy poured lemonade for her family, adding a plate of the oatmeal cookies she'd baked that morning. When she returned to the porch, she found James curled in Owen's lap, his eyes growing heavy despite his attempts to stay awake for the story. Elizabeth still slept peacefully in her basket, one tiny fist pressed against her cheek. Owen looked up as Daisy set the tray on the small table beside him, his smile as warming as the first time she'd seen it fully bloom. After 5 years of marriage, he still looked at her with the same wonder and love he had on their wedding day. "I was just telling James about the day I met you," Owen said softly, mindful of their drowsy son. "Oh?" Daisy raised an eyebrow. "The appropriate version, I hope," Owen chuckled. "I told him I saw the prettiest lady in all of Wyoming Territory and knew right away I wanted to bring her home to Sweet River." "That's not exactly how it happened," Daisy said, though she smiled at the sentiment. Close enough, Owen replied, shifting James to a more comfortable position as the boy finally surrendered to sleep. The important parts are true. I did think you were beautiful, and I did want to help you find a safe place. You never expected that place would be with you, Daisy teased gently, remembering his careful maintenance of boundaries in those early days. Hoped, but didn't expect, Owen corrected. He reached out his free hand to take hers. Every morning I wake up amazed that you're here, that this is our life. Daisy squeezed his hand, understanding completely. I feel the same way. They sat in companionable silence for a time, watching the sun begin its descent toward the western hills, painting the valley in the golden light that had given Sweet River its name. Any regrets? Owen asked eventually, a question he posed on occasion, always with the same underlying concern that she might have wanted a different life in a city perhaps, or back east where society and culture might offer more than their remote Wyoming ranch. Daisy's answer was the same as always, because it was the absolute truth. Not a single one. And as she looked at her sleeping children and the man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved, Daisy knew with perfect certainty that her life had unfolded exactly as it was meant to. From the darkest moment of despair in that Monticello saloon to this peaceful evening on their porch, every step had led her home. Owen's eyes met hers, filled with the understanding that came from years of shared joys and challenges, of building a life together one day at a time. I love you, Daisy Irwin. And I love you, Owen Irwin, she replied, today, tomorrow, and for all the days that follow. As the sun set over Sweet River Ranch, Daisy thought of all the women across the West making lives in this harsh but beautiful land, some by choice, some by circumstance. She had been given a rare gift, a second chance, a new beginning with a man whose quiet strength and steadfast heart had shown her what true love meant. Her brother had sold her for a bottle of whiskey, but Owen Irwin had paid in gold and treated her like a queen. And in doing so, he had given her the greatest treasure of all, a life filled with purpose, belonging, and love that grew stronger with each passing day.